General Hospital spoilers for Thursday, January 8th revealed that Alexis was about to make a move that, in legal terminology, could only be described as reckless. A decision sharp enough to draw blood and bold enough to shift the entire trajectory of the case. And everyone who watched her prepare for it felt the slow tightening of a noose around the courtroom's collective throat. She had been circling the truth for weeks, weaving her arguments with surgical precision, exposing contradictions like she was peeling back layers of rotting wallpaper. But this next step was different. This was not strategy, not caution, not logic. This was a gamble with consequences she could not fully control. The moment she decided to call Scout to testify, the air changed, as if the walls themselves recoiled at the thought of a child being drawn into a fire, meant for adults. But Alexis was convinced that this was the only way to break the stalemate, the only angle left that hadn't been exploited, the only path forward that hadn't already been poisoned by lies, fear, or the carefully constructed narratives protecting the wrong people. She knew exactly how dangerous it was, knew that dragging Scout into the search for Drew's shooter could destabilize the entire case, could emotionally destroy the girl, could trigger backlash so severe even her allies might turn against her. And yet she also knew, with the icy clarity of someone who had run out of time, that Scout had seen something, heard something, felt something in the moments surrounding the shooting, something small enough for adults to dismiss, but sharp enough for Alexis to recognize as a missing piece of a puzzle that refused to come together. Alexis had replayed Scout's hesitant words in her mind over and over again, the fragmented memories, the shadows on the edges of her voice, the half-formed details that only a child would notice because adults were too busy lying, too busy covering tracks, too busy protecting their own reputations to see what was right in front of them. And as Alexis pieced those fragments together, she realized that Scout, without understanding it, held a truth that could redefine everything: truth about Michael's whereabouts, truth about Willow's panic, truth about Jacinda's lies, truth about the quiet footsteps in the hallway moments before the shot was fired. But Alexis also knew that using Scout meant crossing a line she had avoided her entire career, dragging innocence into a battlefield where justice and vengeance blurred so tightly. They were indistinguishable. It was a choice that came with moral consequences. Consequences that gnawed at her nerves even as she drafted the motion to approve the testimony. Yet the fear inside her did not outweigh the fear of letting the wrong person walk free. The fear that the shooter was still hiding behind carefully curated sympathy. The fear that the truth was rotting beneath layers of misdirection. While Port Charles tore itself apart, Scout, unaware of the storm building around her, had begun showing signs of fear that Alexis couldn't ignore: restless sleep, sudden questions about safety, flashes of imagery she wasn't describing as memories, but as feelings that cut too deeply to be ignored. And Alexis, haunted by her own complicated history with truth and accountability, felt an almost primal need to protect her, not by shielding her from the investigation, but by giving her the chance to unburden herself before whatever she knew consumed her from within. But the moment Scout stepped into that courtroom, everything would change: public perception, the emotional balance of the case, the fragile alliances teetering on the edge of collapse. And Alexis understood that one wrong answer, one tremble in Scout's voice, one improvised question from opposing counsel could destroy the entire prosecution. It was a risk so massive it barely made sense to take, a risk no responsible attorney should attempt. But the deeper Alexis sank into the case, the more she felt that caution had become a luxury she could no longer afford. She wasn't just hunting Drew's shooter anymore. She was hunting the truth itself. And truth demanded sacrifice, even if that sacrifice was her own moral comfort. Whispers began to spread through the courthouse long before the hearing began. Whispers that Alexis had lost perspective, that she had become so obsessed with dismantling Michael's lies, that she was willing to weaponize a child. Others said she was desperate, cornered, unraveling under the weight of a case that grew darker and more tangled with every new witness. But some, the ones who understood the stakes, the ones who had seen the pain etched into Scout's small, brittle composure, believed Alexis wasn't reckless, but right, that sometimes the smallest voice carried the truth most clearly. And yet even they feared what this decision would unleash. Because once Scout spoke, once her memory slipped into the center of the courtroom, something irreversible would happen. Someone's life would collapse. Someone's lie would shatter. Someone's guilt would rise to the surface like a drowned body finally breaking through the water. And deep down, Alexis felt it, to that sense of inevitability, that chill running along her spine, that instinct telling her she was about to open a door that could never be closed again. Scout's testimony wouldn't just clarify timelines or expose inconsistencies. It would awaken demons people had worked very hard to bury. It would drag guilt into the light. It would force truth into the open like a wound that refused to stay stitched shut. And Alexis, standing at the edge of this precipice, knew she was stepping into a kind of madness. A legal and emotional battlefield where victory and destruction looked almost identical. But she also knew one more thing: the case had begun to rot from the inside, poisoned by manipulation, lies, and fear. And if someone didn't break the cycle now, Drew Shooter would escape justice forever. So she took a breath that trembled with conviction and dread, signed the final motion, and accepted what came next. Because once Scout walked into that courtroom, nothing, absolutely nothing, would remain the same. Dante had reached the point where the truth pressed against his ribs like a physical weight. A sharp unspoken confession that grew heavier every time he looked at Lulu, and felt the widening distance between what she believed their family still was, and what it had actually become. While she was gone, he had promised himself he would protect her from more pain, that he would not burden her with the chaos that unfolded in her absence, that he would hold every broken piece of their lives together long enough for her to heal. But he had underestimated just how quickly those pieces would begin to slip through his fingers. Now, with every passing day, the lies he told to spare her were becoming the very thing threatening to destroy the fragile recovery she had fought so hard to claim. Lulu was stronger than people realized, but Dante also knew she was walking on emotional glass, still rebuilding the foundation of her life after finally awakening from a state where time had moved without her, decisions had been made without her, and the world had reshaped itself in ways she was still struggling to understand. And now he was about to tell her that their son was unraveling, that Charlotte was changing in ways no one could control, and that the family she barely recognized was closer to breaking than ever before. Rocco had been the first warning sign, though Dante had ignored it at first, convincing himself it was just normal confusion, just a late emotional reaction, just a boy caught between the past he remembered and the present he didn't trust. But the more Dante watched him, the more he saw something darker settling inside the boy: frustration that simmered too quickly, loneliness that dug too deep, and resentment toward the world for moving on while he still felt stuck in the shadow of a mother he couldn't reach and a father who seemed to be stretched thin by responsibilities no child could understand. Dante had tried to be everything at once: parent, protector, buffer, but the more he tried to absorb Rocco's pain, the more he realized he was failing him. That Rocco's anger wasn't just emotional turbulence, it was fear disguised as defiance, a silent scream wrapped in stubbornness, and the only person who could reach him was Lulu. Dante had seen it in the way Rocco's eyes softened whenever her name came up, in the way he paused for a fraction of a second before saying he was fine, in the way his shoulders tensed whenever he felt the distance between what he wanted from his mother and what life had taken from him. And every second Dante delayed telling Lulu the truth only deepened his guilt, only intensified the gnawing certainty that he was making everything worse by trying to protect her from the very thing she needed to hear. But as heavy as Rocco's suffering weighed on him, it was nothing compared to the spiraling darkness Dante saw taking shape around Charlotte. She had always been a complicated child, fiercely emotional, intensely loyal, and shaped by the kind of traumas that rewired a person from the inside out. But the shifts he saw now were different, deeper, more alarming, as if something inside her had snapped loose and was quietly rearranging itself into a version of her he no longer recognized. She moved through rooms with a stillness that made Dante uneasy, watching people with a sharp, calculating attention that felt too mature, too knowing for her age. She had become less reactive and more observant, less impulsive and more controlled, as though she had finally realized that power didn't come from chaos but from precision. And that realization frightened Dante more than anything else, because it meant she wasn't simply responding to trauma, she was adapting to it, weaponizing it, shaping it into a tool she could use to navigate the world in ways that felt disturbingly inherited. Dante tried to convince himself he was imagining it, that he was projecting fears onto her because he was overwhelmed, because he had too many battles on too many fronts. But every time Charlotte spoke, every time she offered a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, every time she positioned herself between him and Rocco with a protectiveness that bordered on possessive, Dante felt a chill move through him like a distant warning. Charlotte's shift wasn't loud, it was subtle enough that those who didn't look closely would dismiss it as simple adolescence, but Dante wasn't fooled. He saw the way she watched Rocco, not like a sister or a friend, but like someone studying a puzzle she intended to solve. He saw the way she stepped in before Rocco could finish a sentence, finishing it for him with an eerie accuracy that suggested she had memorized his emotional patterns. He saw the way she corrected him softly but sharply, reinforcing her influence over him with the same careful tone someone might use to tame a wild animal. And worst of all, Dante saw the way Rocco responded, hesitation dissolving into obedience, anger folding into quiet acceptance, confusion replaced by a strange, reluctant trust. It frightened him how easily Charlotte slipped into that role, how effortlessly she gained Rocco's loyalty, how quickly she became the person he sought reassurance from. even when she was the one stirring his unease. Dante didn't want to believe that Charlotte was manipulating him intentionally, but the signs kept stacking, undeniable and chilling, forming a pattern too precise to be accidental. That was the truth. He had to tell Lulu the truth that would break her heart, before it saved her child. He had practiced the words in his head, tried to find a way to soften them, tried to imagine a version of the conversation where she didn't look at him with betrayal, where she didn't collapse under the weight of yet another crisis she hadn't chosen. But the moment he opened his mouth to speak, he knew there was no gentle version, no painless path forward, because everything about their lives had become too tightly wound, too interconnected, too dependent on truths that had been avoided for too long. He had to tell her that Rocco needed her more than ever, that he was slipping into a darkness only she could pull him from. He had to tell her that Charlotte was becoming unpredictable, that her behavior was no longer simply concerning but potentially dangerous. He had to tell her that he had failed to shield their family from collapsing into emotional chaos, that he needed her strength, her clarity, her presence to fix what he no longer could. And beneath all of that, buried somewhere deeper even he didn't want to look, was a fear that this revelation could break them apart too. That bringing Lulu into the truth would force them both to confront the painful reality. That love wasn't enough to hold a damaged family together. That the ghosts of their past mistakes, separations, betrayals, heartbreak were still alive beneath the surface. That telling Lulu the truth wasn't just about protecting their children. It was about ripping open wounds neither of them had healed. Dante had never been more afraid. And yet he also knew there was no other choice. The future of their children, the fragile, unstable futures of both Rocco and Charlotte depended on what he told Lulu next. And as he looked at her, steadying himself for the confession that would change everything, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Not from weakness but from the terrifying realization that this moment, this truth, this crack in their lives would determine whether their family survived or shattered for good. When Trina and Kai finally pieced together the one detail everyone else had overlooked about the night of the shooting, it felt less like uncovering a clue and more like ripping open a wound the entire town had tried to pretend was already healed. Because the truth they stumbled onto did not simply point toward a suspect. It exposed a chain of events so tangled, so emotionally charged, so brutally intimate that it threatened to collapse every lie constructed to protect the wrong people. They realized, almost at the same time, that the angle of the bullets entering Drew's back didn't match the official narrative, that the spacing between the shots indicated hesitation rather than intent, that whoever pulled the trigger fired twice not because they wanted Drew dead, but because the first moment of panic spiraled into a second moment of desperate fear. And the moment they understood that, the entire investigation shifted violently. Because this wasn't the work of an assassin or a stranger or a hired gun, this was someone close, someone emotionally compromised, someone who knew Drew well enough to be terrified of what he was about to reveal that night. And as that truth crystallized between Trina and Kai, the implications rippled outward toward Michael like a spark reaching a pool of gasoline. Because Michael's obsession with controlling the narrative, protecting his version of the truth, and shielding the person he loved most suddenly looked less like loyalty and more like panic. The realization hit Kai first that Drew's unraveling in the days after the shooting, the unpredictable rage simmering beneath his calm exterior, the frantic desperation to keep certain conversations buried, all pointed towards something far more personal than anyone had allowed themselves to consider. Drew wasn't simply traumatized. He was haunted by the knowledge that the person who shot him hadn't done it out of malice, but out of fear. Fear that he had seen something he should not have seen. Fear that he had discovered the one secret capable of destroying not just them, but everyone connected to them. Trina caught on a heartbeat later, her breath tightening as she replayed everything she remembered about that night, the way Willow avoided eye contact, the strange tension between her and Michael, the quiet panic beneath their carefully rehearsed statements, the way Michael stepped in too quickly, too aggressively, to redirect suspicion toward anyone but the woman he was so determined to protect. And suddenly it was impossible to ignore the pattern forming around them. Michael's increasingly erratic behavior, his sharp edges, his paranoia, his need to manipulate evidence and testimonies. Not because he wanted to punish someone, but because he was desperate to shield someone. That someone being Willow. The two bullets made sense now. The panicked shooter made sense. The way Drew froze whenever her name was mentioned made sense. And the breakdown he suffered after waking up, the rage he couldn't control, the nightmares no one could soothe, they all pointed toward a truth, too devastating for him to carry alone. He knew who shot him, or at least he knew who was in the room when the shots were fired, and rather than destroy her life with the truth, he tried to destroy himself with silence. But silence is unstable, and Drew's mental state had begun to crack under the pressure of carrying someone else's guilt. He became unpredictable, volatile, prone to flashes of anger that didn't match his character. And the more he tried to suppress the memory, the louder it grew. Until the man who once prided himself on composure now seemed ready to attack anyone who even brushed against the truth. Meanwhile, Michael was spiraling into his own obsession. Convinced he could keep the secret buried if he simply outmaneuvered Alexis, intimidated Tracy, silenced Jacinda, and dismantled the prosecution piece by piece. Michael didn't know the full truth, he only knew enough to be terrified. He knew Willow had lied. He knew her timeline didn't match. He knew she disappeared during the crucial minutes before the gunfire. And he knew she came back trembling, pale, and unable to speak. Michael had convinced himself she was innocent, that she acted in self-defense, that Drew had startled her, that the darkness of the room made everything worse, but deep down, beneath all the excuses and half-truths, the fear consuming him was far more painful. What if Willow had pulled the trigger, without realizing what she was doing? What if the panic overtook her? What if she had been trying to protect Michael, not herself? And what if the second shot, the one fired just a fraction of a second after the first, was the real mistake? The one that would damn her forever if anyone realized the truth? That fear turned Michael into something unrecognizable. His obsession with controlling the courtroom narrative was no longer about righteousness. It was about survival, about preventing the one truth capable of destroying the woman he loved, the truth capable of shattering the family he fought so hard to rebuild. He wasn't just manipulating, he was unraveling. He wasn't just protecting, he was drowning. And Trina and Kai, standing on the cusp of their discovery, felt the weight of that unraveling pressing down on them like a storm about to break open the sky. Because once they stepped forward, once they admitted what the evidence truly revealed, they wouldn't just expose the identity of Drew's shooter. They would ignite the collapse of everything Michael was trying to hold together, everything Drew was trying to forget, everything Willow was trying to hide, everything the town had been too afraid to confront. And the truth waiting on the other side of their revelation wasn't just shocking, it was catastrophic. Brooklyn reaching out to Sunny again felt like reopening a door that had been closed for far too long, a door she once swore she would never step through again. But desperation has a way of resurrecting old alliances, and as her world tightened with secrets, lies, and the suffocating fear of losing everything she'd fought to rebuild, she found herself gravitating back toward the one man who understood what it meant to keep a family together, even when the entire city wanted to tear it apart. Their conversations began quietly, cautiously, like two people testing the temperature of a dangerous past. But it didn't take long before Brooklyn slipped into the familiar rhythm of Sunny's intensity, his ability to see straight through her polished facade, and recognize the cracks she tried to hide from Chase, from her family, from herself. And the more she confided in him, the more Sunny recognized something chilling. Brooklyn wasn't just anxious, she was terrified. Not for herself, but for Chase, whose behavior had begun to shift into something darker, more volatile, more obsessive. A slow unraveling he couldn't see in himself, but she couldn't ignore anymore. Chase had always been controlled, measured, and fiercely loyal. But ever since the night of the shooting, ever since Michael began spiraling and Drew's trauma seeped into every inch of Port Charles, Chase had been carrying something heavy, something that made him watch every move Michael made and every lie Willow told with a growing intensity that bordered on fixation. He had begun pacing at night, replaying details that didn't fit, interrogating moments that didn't make sense, snapping whenever Brooklyn tried to redirect him toward calm. And though he insisted he just wanted justice, Brooklyn could feel the panic in him, the fear that he was protecting the wrong people, the fear that Willow was hiding something that could crush the entire investigation. But what terrified Brooklyn most wasn't Chase's obsession, it was the part of Willow's secret she had accidentally glimpsed, the part that tied Willow to the shooting in a way that made Chase's unraveling feel like the beginning of something catastrophic. Willow's guilt was no longer subtle, it was etched beneath her voice, threaded through her brittle composure, visible in the way she flinched at sudden sounds, avoided mirrors, avoided the hospital corridors where Drew once walked, avoided Michael's eyes as if his love had become another wound she couldn't bear. Brooklyn hadn't meant to overhear the argument between Willow and Michael. She had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong moment. But the words she caught, "You can't protect me forever, they'll know what I did," the second shot wasn't supposed to happen, were enough to send her spiraling into a panic she couldn't unhear. And the moment she tried to deny what she'd heard, Chase's growing obsession made denial impossible. His questions became sharper, his instincts more dangerous, and Brooklyn realized with horror that he was inches away from discovering a truth that would destroy Willow, destroy Michael, and destroy their entire family. That was the moment she called Sunny, not because she wanted to involve him, but because she needed someone ruthless enough to understand what was at stake. Sunny listened in silence, absorbing every word, every tremble in her voice, Every piece of the truth she was terrified to speak aloud, and when she finally finished, he told her something she already knew deep in her bones: if Chase finds out. Before we get ahead of this, everything blows up, and that was when the real fear began to take shape. Because Brooke Lynn realized that all her efforts to keep the peace, all her attempts to protect Chase from the truth, all her desperate hopes that Willow would come clean before someone else exposed her, were collapsing in real time. Chase's obsession with the inconsistencies in the investigation was rapidly spiraling into a dangerous clarity, and the closer he got to unlocking the truth, the more Brooke Lynn felt a suffocating dread clawing at her chest. Because she knew Chase's loyalty would break the moment he learned what Willow had done. He would go after her. He would go after Michael. He would go after anyone who tried to cover it up. And once he made that choice, Chase would lose everything: his career, his reputation, his future with her. Sunny saw it too, saw the inevitability in the way the pieces were lining up, saw the shadow forming around Chase's moral code, saw the way Brooke Lynn's voice cracked whenever she mentioned his name. And Sunny understood that the danger wasn't the secret itself. It was the moment the secret collided with Chase's need for justice. But what neither of them expected, what hit them like a punch to the chest, was the moment they realized Willow wasn't just hiding guilt. She was unraveling under it. Her hands shook. Her breath hitched at random moments. Her eyes kept drifting toward escape routes. And Brooke Lynn understood with sickening clarity that Willow was nearing a breaking point. She wasn't stable. She wasn't safe. She wasn't thinking clearly. And if anyone pushed her too far, Chase, Alexis, even Michael, she might confess everything in a moment of emotional collapse. And that confession, no matter how honest, would destroy every single life connected to her. That was the shock that hit Sunny and Brooke Lynn hardest, not the truth itself, but the realization that Willow was a ticking bomb neither of them had fully acknowledged. And now they were both in deeper than they ever intended. Brooke Lynn caught between the man she loved and the family she feared for, and Sunny caught between loyalty, justice, and the instinct to protect the innocent even when the innocent had made a deadly mistake. And for the first time, both of them understood that the secret Willow carried wasn't just going to ruin Michael or Chase. It was going to drag the entire town into the fire the moment it detonated.